Well, in this fifth and quite short video, I want to briefly look at how the capitalists and the monarchy reacted to the mounting onslaught that we've discussed in the previous video. And the different parties of the ruling class drew together to fight their common enemy, the masses, and their uprising. Already by 1915, the bourgeois deputies in the Duma had united into what was called the Progressive Bloc. And that featured in particular Guchkov, a big Moscow industrialist, who was leader of the party of the big commercial, industrial and landowning bourgeoisie, the Octoberists. And alongside him stood Mulyakov, a professor of history, leader of the cadets, the party of the supposedly liberal middle bourgeoisie, intelligentsia and relatively progressive landlords. The bourgeoisie hoped that under the burden of both the external military defeats and internal dangers, the Tsar would be prepared to allow the capitalists to at least have some say in government. Even a majority of the Tsar's own ministers were prepared to do a deal with the Progressive Bloc to try and take some of the pressure off their hated regime. However, Tsar Nicholas II had absolutely no intention of making even the slightest concession. A group of extreme right-wing bureaucrats advised the Tsar of the dangers of doing any deals with the weak and unstable bourgeoisie. They saw any concessions as being just the first step on the slippery slope to mob rule. Their advice was instead a policy of ruthless repression. Now, Trotsky makes the point that actually that might have been a sensible policy for reaction if they'd had the same basis of support as in, say, 1905. But unfortunately for them, history had now moved on, and the military forces themselves that they wanted to use to put down rebellion were beginning to be seized by rebellion themselves. As the crisis deepened, the Tsar, perhaps in a sense aware that history was about to finally catch up with him and his outdated regime, reassured himself by becoming more and more indifferent to events around him. And actually Trotsky has a few pages that I won't cover, making an interesting comparison between the characters of Nicholas II with Louis in France and Charles I in England before the English Civil War, how all three of them showed similar characters before the end came to their regimes. But also, just as an example, the pettiness of the Tsar's diary reveals his mentality. For example, on the day of quite an important decision, when the Tsar decided to dissolve again the Duma, he wrote simply, "Very busy morning, half an hour late to breakfast with the officers. A storm came up and it was very muggy. Signed a decree dissolving the Duma. Dined with Olga and Petya. Read all evening." Trotsky points out that just an exclamation mark after the word Duma was his only show of emotion at this absolutely critical time. But it was the Tsarina, Alexandra, who began to have more and more influence over the Tsar's decisions. She turned the court circle yet further away from the troubles of the real world and towards the medieval superstitions of the other world, relying on the opinions of her own Christ on earth, Rasputin. And it's often said that every great revolution begins at the top. And as things got ever worse, the crisis in society was reflected in the splits in the ruling class. Blamed for everything by the masses, the bureaucracy began to blame each other, and increasingly the Tsar himself, for their desperate position. In desperation, Trotsky explains that there was talk of a palace revolution which spread in the upper circles of Petrograd society. In the end, they settled simply for a little revolution, the murder of Rasputin. What effect do you think, though, that these splits at the top had on the masses below? Well, Trotsky explains that all these splits at the top filter down into the psychology of the masses below, and far from weakening the crisis, they sharpened it. In the army, in the village, in the factories, the masses thought to themselves, if even our rulers have to resort to murder to solve their problems, Why shouldn't we use a little force of our own? And the actions of the ruling layers had an opposite effect to that intended, only spurring on their mortal enemy, the proletariat and the poor peasantry.